The question is no longer whether the United States can send warships into the Persian Gulf. That question has already been answered. The real question, the one that will define the next phase of this conflict, is whether America can stay there without paying a price so high that the entire architecture of control it built over decades starts to crack, because Hormuz has entered a new phase, and that means this is no longer just a Middle East story. This is an oil story, an inflation story, a global shipping story, a China story, a credibility story, and most of all, it is a story about whether the most important energy choke point on Earth is still protected by American power or merely contested by it. That distinction matters more than most people realize. A lot of commentators have looked at this crisis and immediately focused on the hardware, the missiles, the destroyers, the interceptors, the radar systems. But that is not the deepest layer of the story. The deeper layer is geography, cost, nerve, political endurance, the question of who can stay in the fight longer when every hour inside that narrow waterway becomes more expensive, more dangerous, and more politically toxic. And once you see it that way, the entire picture changes. Because this is not a simple military confrontation between Washington and Tehran. It is a stress test for the whole post-Cold War order in the Gulf. The Strait of Hormuz, through which around 20 million barrels of oil and petroleum products flowed every single day before this crisis began, accounting for roughly 1/5 of global petroleum consumption and 1/5 of all LNG trade, has been effectively shut down for weeks. Oil prices crossed $100 a barrel in early March for the first time in 4 years. Insurance markets have repriced risk at levels not seen since the 1980s. Over 150 ships anchored outside the strait rather than attempt transit. These are not hypothetical scenarios. These are the facts on the ground right now. And that is why the story cannot stop at the military dimension. It has to go deeper. What makes Hormuz different from almost every other maritime space on Earth is that it punishes distance and rewards proximity. On a map, it looks like a shipping corridor. In strategic reality, it is a compression chamber, a narrow passage where geography strips away some of the advantages a global naval power usually enjoys, and hands leverage to the actor sitting on the shoreline. That is the first thing most people miss. When people imagine American power, they imagine scale, carrier groups, destroyers, surveillance aircraft, long-range strike, a navy that can project force across entire oceans. And all of that is real, but reach is not the same thing as control. You can reach a place and still be unable to secure it at an acceptable cost. You can enter a choke point and still be trapped by the geometry of that choke point. And that is the deeper strategic problem this conflict has now made visible. Hormuz matters because so much of the global economy was built on the assumption that it would keep functioning normally. That assumption was part of the system. Tankers moved because insurers believed risk was manageable. Markets stayed calm because traders believed disruption would be temporary. Allies stayed aligned because they believed the United States could keep this corridor open without losing control of the escalation ladder. That assumption is now being tested in real time. And that is why the weapon being deployed here is not just the missile, it is geography turned into cost. By using the coastline, distributed positions, drones, and a layered architecture of threats, Iran has achieved something strategically significant. It has made transit through Hormuz costly enough to effectively halt normal commercial shipping. Iran does not need to dominate the Gulf in the imperial sense. It does not need to replace the U.S. Navy. It only needs to prove what it has already demonstrated, that American protection inside this space is no longer cheap, no longer automatic, and no longer psychologically unquestioned. That is how denial works. Denial is different from control. Control means you can manage the space. Denial means you can make that space too costly for someone else to manage the way they used to. And in modern conflict, especially around choke points, denial is often enough. In fact, denial may be the more realistic form of leverage for a regional power facing a global one. A destroyer is an extraordinary military platform. It carries sensors, weapon systems, trained personnel, command infrastructure, symbolic weight, and political meaning. It is not just steel. It is prestige, it is deterrence, it is a promise made visible. And that means it is also uniquely exposed to cost asymmetric pressure in confined spaces. Because if a much cheaper, more distributed architecture can threaten a much more expensive platform in a narrow body of water, the battlefield is no longer measuring power in the old way. It is measuring who can impose cost more efficiently. That is the second layer of the story. The third layer is what strategic analysts have long understood about confined maritime theaters. Effective pressure in spaces like this does not come from improvisation. It comes from preparation, from understanding the structural conditions of the theater, identifying where geography limits maneuver, and exploiting the gap between a defender's capacity and the scope of simultaneous demands placed on that capacity. This is a structural feature of how smaller powers have historically contested narrow spaces against larger ones, and it helps explain why this crisis has proven so difficult to resolve quickly. Systems are stressed when they face simultaneous demands from multiple directions, when the complexity of the situation exceeds the bandwidth of the response. The problem is not one incoming threat. The problem is the architecture of the challenge. Once a naval force begins exhausting its response capacity, once the layered structure of its defenses is strained, the expensive platform starts losing the very thing that made it reassuring in the first place, the perception of control. And once that perception breaks, the strategic effect travels much faster than the tactical one. Now step back and look at this from a broader strategic perspective. Iran's calculus, as analysts across the political spectrum have long argued, has arguably never required the conquest of the Gulf in the classic blue water naval sense. What it requires is leverage, a way to tell every outside power, you may be able to enter this space, but you will not enter it on comfortable terms. You will not enter it under the old assumptions. You will not enter it without exposing your own political system, your alliances, and your economy to consequences. That is not dominance, but it is power, and it is power that has now been demonstrated, not merely theorized. Every actor in the region is recalculating. Washington is weighing how to respond without making this worse, and has now announced a naval blockade of Iranian ports, adding a new layer of pressure while raising new questions about escalation. The Gulf monarchies, several of which have already absorbed drone and missile strikes in this conflict, are reassessing how much faith they can place in an umbrella that now comes with serious exposure. The energy markets are pricing in a waterway that can no longer be treated as routine. Beijing is playing a careful game. China's foreign minister has made dozens of phone calls to all parties. Chinese envoys have traveled to the region for mediation, and Trump himself has acknowledged that China played a role in bringing Iran to the table for ceasefire talks. At the same time, Iran initially allowed only Chinese vessels through the strait, reflecting the depth of those ties. China is expanding its influence through utility, exactly the model strategic analysts had long predicted. Moscow is watching from a position of advantage, higher energy prices, proof that anti-access logic works, and a major diversion of American attention and resources. That is why this is not a narrow military story. It is a system story. And once you understand that, the American dilemma becomes clearer. The problem for Washington is not the absence of options. The problem is that every option now carries visible cost. Military strikes have degraded some capacity, but have not restored the old order. The naval blockade adds pressure but also risks new escalation and places strain on relationships with China and India, both of which depend heavily on the energy flowing through this strait. Restraint risks looking like weakness. Force risks proving that the U.S. must spend more and more to defend a space it once stabilized almost by default. That is the most difficult strategic position for a dominant power to occupy. Not that it has no power, but that it still has immense power while every use of that power becomes more expensive, more fragile, and less politically sustainable. And this is where many mainstream analyses still miss the point. They treat credibility as if it were just about retaliation, as if the whole question is whether America hits back hard enough. But credibility is not only about punishment. It is also about whether allies, markets, and adversaries believe your presence still produces order at a cost you can bear. When your presence produces volatility, insurance spikes, strategic hesitation, and questions about your staying power, credibility has already begun to erode, regardless of how many additional strikes are launched. That erosion may be gradual in some respects, but the events of the past 6 weeks have accelerated it considerably. Orders weaken when actors begin quietly adjusting behavior, when Gulf states hedge more aggressively, when importers diversify faster, when military planners redesign assumptions, when energy traders stop treating the old normal as normal, when outside powers realize they can gain influence simply by being useful in a crisis the old guarantor can no longer cheaply contain. That is how strategic transitions really happen. And we are watching one unfold in real time. Now let's go one layer deeper, because this is where the story becomes even more important. A shock in Hormuz is never just about military balance. It immediately becomes a macroeconomic event. Risk around this choke point has been repriced, and so has oil. With energy costs rising sharply, inflation pressure is returning to economies that were only beginning to recover from the previous cycle. Central banks face harder choices. Energy importing economies face tighter margins. Domestic politics become more brittle. Strategic patience declines. And the room for measured statecraft shrinks at exactly the moment it is needed most. That is the domino logic. And it is no longer theoretical. One choke point, one real disruption, one repricing of maritime risk. And the shock travels from the strait into household budgets, election cycles, alliance management, and global capital flows. Roughly 20% of global LNG trade, nearly 1/5 of all petroleum liquids consumed worldwide, nearly 34% of global crude oil trade, all of it was routed through this single passage before this crisis began. The numbers make the exposure undeniable, and this is also why Iran's strategic mindset cannot be reduced to simple cost-benefit charts drawn in Washington. For Iran, this geography is not abstract. It is bound up with history, war memory, sanctions, encirclement concerns, and the conviction that self-reliance is not optional. You do not have to endorse Tehran's worldview to understand that it exists, that it has depth, and that it helps explain why outside pressure has so often failed to generate the behavioral change Washington expected. This matters because great powers often misread adversaries, not by underestimating their weapons, but by underestimating the durability of their preferences. If an adversary sees a space as existential while you see it as one theater among many, then your models are already misaligned. If they are willing to absorb enormous pressure to establish denial capacity, while you are trying to preserve low-cost order across multiple regions at once, then the pressure accumulates asymmetrically. And eventually what looked like a manageable regional problem becomes a test of strategic bandwidth. That is the deeper structural warning embedded in what we are now watching. So the most important question is not whether this conflict proves the end of American power. Serious analysis should avoid that kind of theatrical certainty. The United States retains enormous military capabilities, global alliances, long-range options, and escalation tools. Iran, for its part, has demonstrated the ability to make a space contested, but has not been able to build a stable replacement order for the entire region. Those limits matter. We should be honest about them. But being honest about those limits does not make the situation less serious. It makes the analysis sharper. Because the true issue is not whether America is present in the Gulf. America is present. The true issue is whether the old operating assumption survives. The assumption that the United States can keep the world's most important energy corridor open, reassure allies, discipline adversaries, stabilize markets, and absorb the costs of doing so, without beginning to strain the rest of its global position. That assumption is under the most serious pressure it has faced in decades. We are looking at convergence, energy insecurity converging with military vulnerability, regional rivalry converging with global inflation risk, alliance hesitation converging with great power competition, the decline of cheap control converging with the rise of actors who gain leverage from disorder rather than order. And layered on top of all of that in the Middle East are the civilizational, historical, and religious narratives that give every crisis a meaning far beyond its immediate strategic facts. Moments like this are dangerous because so many fault lines begin moving at once. The real issue in Hormuz is not access. America will likely restore some degree of access. The question is at what cost? Military cost, political cost, economic cost, alliance cost, inflation cost, credibility cost, the cost of operating in a narrow waterway, and discovering that reach is no longer the same thing as control, and that control is no longer the same thing as order. If that cost has truly changed, and the evidence of the past 6 weeks suggests it has, then the story is not about one strike, or one blockade, or one exchange. It is about whether the post-Cold War model of American power in the Gulf is entering a phase where it can still be asserted, but no longer cheaply sustained. And once that happens, every actor in the system begins moving. That is the story beneath the headlines. That is the map beneath the panic. And that is the question that will define what comes next. Not who can enter Hormuz, but who can still bear the cost of trying to control what happens there.